Professor Brad served as the founding provost and dean of Patrick Henry College, the executive director, CEO of the Christian Legal Society, the associate dean of the proposed School of Law at Geneva College, a staff attorney in the Center for Law and Religious Freedom, a director of Justice Fellowship, Policy Institute, and Prison Fellowship Ministries, and he's the author of numerous scholarly articles. I'm not going to read them all. I'm not going to read them all. Right? And I don't know if any of you listen to WNIS radio. He is frequently on Tony McCreary's morning news show. I'd like to welcome Professor Brad J.
Oh, I got a gavel. I feel powerful up here. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. When Diana invited me a little while back, she suggested that I talk a little about the Bill of Rights with perhaps a specific focus on the Second Amendment. And I think perhaps we were anticipating that around this week there might be some things going on in Richmond that would require one to be well versed in the Second Amendment. Now, the General Assembly has chosen not to follow the governor down that path, and so for right now we don't have any of those difficult issues. Now, I will say there's some tough questions that get involved in gun laws and the Second Amendment. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. I want to start by backing up and just kind of work my way into the Bill of Rights and from there into the Second Amendment. And I really don't want to talk for too long. My goal here is to speak for maybe 20, 30 minutes and then open it up and you all can ask questions about what I'm talking about or anything else related to the Constitution, the courts. That's really my expertise. I'm not a political expert. I'm an interested layman when it comes to watching what's going on in the political realm, but I know a fair amount about the Supreme Court and about the United States Constitution. So if you think of any questions, just hang on to them, either about my talk or other things that you want to talk about, and I'll come to those in just a little bit. When you think about the Bill of Rights, it's important to recognize the context in which it was developed. The context, of course, was this tumultuous breaking of the American colonies away from England, this little thing we call the American Revolution, which we won, by the way, in case anybody didn't get the news. We won. But at that time, there were at least two and eventually three different visions for what sort of thing the United States of America was going to be. The earliest understanding was that United States of America, that's plural. There are states and they have united. So you would say in a sentence, the United States of America are working together for the common good. Plural. Sovereignty lying in the 13 colonies who declared their independence, declared themselves to be sovereign states holding a God-ordained authority to govern their people who were going to unite, who were working together first in the war and then somehow after the war. But that's where it got tricky. That's where they found a hard time making it work. Now, the first governmental structure of the United States of America was called the Articles of Confederation. We started with the Declaration of Independence. That's not a government structure. That's I sometimes call it the corporate charter of the United States. It's a legal document saying this is an entity that exists. Here's why we're taking our place among the nations of the earth as a political entity. Here's the reasons why we're doing it. It's a philosophical, it's a political document. It's making the arguments why it is appropriate for the American colonies to engage in violent overthrow of the established government. I mean, that's what it was. We tend sometimes to sugarcoat the revolution from our perspective, but England was the governing authority, and we took up arms to say, no, you will not govern us anymore. We will be a free and independent people, and the Declaration is a document that's making the arguments why. Why is that appropriate? But that doesn't get you very far. If all you've got is a declaration, you don't know how to run anything. And so they came up with the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation clearly placed sovereignty in the states. Each of the 13 states was the sovereign nation. The Articles create what we might think of today as a treaty, as some sort of international organization, more akin perhaps to the European Union or NATO or some such body, with sovereign states working together. One of my favorite phrases out of the Articles of Confederation is they say they are entering into a firm league of friendship. Well, if you're in a firm league of friendship with somebody, they don't govern you. If you're in a firm league of friendship, you're talking equals. Equals working together. And that was the original vision. The Articles had one big problem. They didn't work. You had no effective way of dealing with the issues that came up, both during the war and after the war. It was a cumbersome governmental body. There was no executive. There was a guy who was called the president, but it was actually in the more literal meaning of a presiding officer. It was what we call today the Speaker of the House, the presider. That was the president. But there was no executive branch. There was no judicial branch. All you had was the Congress. And again, a little bit like the European Union. You've got all these different states would send their representatives and argue, and every decision required at least 9 of 13 to agree, and many required unanimity. It was a recipe for doing nothing, and that's basically what the government did under the Articles of Confederation. You started to see a new movement arising as people recognized the Articles weren't working. People who argued for a strong national government, who were saying, no, we can't be... Do you need me to pause, ladies? I don't want to...
Do you mind? Everybody's having some glare. And they are doing a Facebook Live, and it's like blocking the screen.
Facebook Live?
Yes,
so
did
all the 3 people who were interested in hearing me speak can all listen in at the same time?
So this way, maybe if you're not with the sun backing, he doesn't have that glare on his...
Whatever you'd like. I can sit at the piano and play chopsticks while I talk.
I'm sorry.
No.
Strong national government. That's what
Strong national government. The idea was, no, we're not going to be plural United States of America. We're going to be a singular it. The United States of America is a great nation. Go from plural to singular. One nation, one country. 4 men in particular championed this vision. Alexander Hamilton, who was the great intellectual force behind the strong national government. James Madison, who started out on that side as what we'll call a Federalist, although he later, under the influence of his buddy Thomas Jefferson, kind of shifted over to the other group and became more of a state sovereignty guy. But initially, he was right there with the Federalist national government arguments. John Jay, very well-respected, well-known lawyer, judge, leader of the Revolutionary time, and perhaps most significantly, George Washington, the man who had more credibility and more clout than anyone else in North America. George Washington was looking at the Articles of Confederation and saying, this just doesn't work. This doesn't work, it's not working. And so these men had an alternative vision that we will be one country. And the states will just be political subdivisions. Just as the Commonwealth of Virginia has counties and cities. The city of Virginia Beach has no independent sovereignty. Virginia Beach exists because Virginia wants it to exist. If the Commonwealth ever wanted to get rid of a city, a county, it could do that and govern directly. Cities, counties are creatures of state law. They have no independent sovereignty. The vision for a national government was kind of to have states be the same way. And so a convention was called, you probably know this story, a convention to tweak the Articles of Confederation a little bit. They were going to do a few little amendments here or there to improve the document. Well, they gathered these folks together in Philadelphia in 1787, and they tweaked the Articles of Confederation by deleting every word, including the title, and starting over again. Excuse me. It was what we might call a significant tweak. Okay? They started over, and they started writing a new governing document. And this is where you started to get into a real, straight-up fight between the people who wanted one nation with administrative subdivisions, so that Virginia would do some of the work here, and Maryland there, and Georgia there, between that group and the people who wanted 13 sovereigns cooperating. Now, even the people who wanted 13 sovereigns, by the time we lived under the Articles of Confederation, were willing to say, we need more of a national government than this. I'm very sorry. I've had a thing in my throat and sinuses for about a week now, and it just won't quite finish going away. Everybody agreed we had to do something to make the national government stronger than it had been under the Articles. The question was, where do we end up? Do we end up national? Do we end up, oh, bless you, thank you so much. Do we end up national, or do we end up with the states having the sovereignty? Oh, that helps, thank you. It ended up being a battle that could be won by neither side. There was too much division. And so the founders did something unique in world history, something that had never been done before. There were two contributions made by the American founders to the history of political thought, two things that had never been done before. One was the idea of having a written document that would govern the government, that your executive, your legislative, your judicial would all have to follow. This thing that we call the Constitution. That was one. The other was this idea that we call federalism, or perhaps dual sovereignty. The idea of a sovereign nation made up of sovereign states. As they fought through this in the Constitutional Convention, with neither side able to fully get its vision in place, this was essentially the compromise. They ended on it. We will keep sovereignty in the states. We will also create a viable, sovereign, energetic is one of the words they like to use, an energetic national government. With the idea being that the national government would be supreme over those areas where it held sovereignty. There's a power that the national government has, then the national government wins. But they thought they were giving the national government a relatively short list of things that it could do. And so in the vision of the founders, what they thought, this isn't all of what George Washington wanted. George Washington wanted more in the national government than this. But it's a lot more than Thomas Jefferson wanted in the national government. So you see there's this kind of this give and take. But the idea was, if it's not in the document, if it doesn't say this belongs to the national government, then it is still a power of the states, and the national government shouldn't be messing around. Now, we won't go into the number of things that the national government of this country has legislated and regulated that aren't even remotely contained in the list of powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Suffice to say that if they'd actually been following it for 230 years or whatever it is, the U.S. Code annotator would be about this thick instead of shelves and shelves and shelves of federal statutes. So we don't live in that world anymore. But I think it's important to understand what they were trying to do. And I think you can think of this idea of dual sovereignty or federalism as a pendulum. Okay? The Articles of Confederation have been way over here. State sovereignty, almost to the exclusion of national sovereignty. Just nothing there, no effective national government. The founders were trying to pull that pendulum into the middle. They were trying to create a government that had a balance between an effective nation, but states which are closer to the people and more responsive to the people than the national government, states holding the sovereignty over most of the stuff of people's daily lives. Most criminal law belonged to the states. It wasn't a federal thing. Many areas of law were understood as being state law, not national. What does the national government deal with? Well, the national government deals with defense, protecting the nation. It deals with currency. You need to have a common means of exchange so that people can do commerce around all the states. You don't want to have different money systems in all 13. Those kinds of things. There were some very specific, and again, if you look at the Constitution and you look at Article 1, Section 8, there's a list there of the things that they said Congress has the power to do. They can run post offices and post roads. They can handle patents and trademarks. Just mostly very specific kinds of powers. And they thought by getting the federal government powerful, but only in those limited areas, they were going to put this pendulum in the middle. Now what's happened, of course, since that day, is the pendulum has gone over here. We now have a national government that runs almost completely roughshod over the states as well as often the will of the people, a national government that has very few controls and now today is so ripped up by partisan bickering that it doesn't do much of anything. We're almost back under the Articles of Confederation with a national government that doesn't do much of everything, except the Supreme Court, which is all-powerful and essentially governs all of us, which is especially PG since that's only 9 people and we don't ever get to vote for them and they stay in office until they die. So we're no longer in the middle. But they were trying to get in the middle. They were trying to get this balance. And that balance is what we call federalism. Federalism is an effective, vibrant national government with limits so that you also have effective, vibrant state governments. And I'll tell you my foremost reason why I think that's important and why I think we have been harmed significantly in this country by the not total destruction, but significant reduction in federalism. And it's because I like to think of power in, when I do this you can see it, in triangles. In triangles. And I think the founders, although you won't find the word triangle in the Federalist Papers anywhere, I think the founders understood that if you divide power between 2 points and one starts getting more powerful, it can overrun the other and you end up with tyranny. But if there are 3 roughly equal sources of power and one of them starts trying to increase its own authority, the other 2 will band together and push it back into place. And I think we see a number of instances of this. Of course, in the national government, we have the executive, the legislative, the judicial. 3 branches. If one of them grabs too much power, the other 2 each have checks and balances that they can use to push them back into place. But I think in this federalism question, they also saw three interests: the national, the local or individual, and the states. And the states were supposed to have a voice. It was supposed to be the United States Senate. Go off on that for an hour. Yeah, invite me back sometime. We'll talk about the 17th Amendment and the Senate. But the idea was to have the people who are represented in the House of Representatives, the states represented in the Senate, the President and the Supreme Court are essentially national institutions. Those three sets of interests would balance each other. And guess what? If there's a bill proposed that would damage the sovereign interests of Virginia, and if Virginia's two senators had been chosen by the legislature in Richmond to represent the government of Virginia, you think our senators are going to vote for that bill? No. But that's not the world we live in. Senators view themselves as national political figures. They do not view themselves as guarding the sovereign interests of their states. Okay, I'm rambling a little bit. But this is that federalism balance question that was so important to the founders. So the Constitution is written, it goes out, and we get into a big fight over whether it will be ratified or not. And interestingly, the group who are for the Constitution call themselves the Federalists, right? Madison, Hamilton, Jay, those guys. They're the Federalists. They want the Constitution. But there's a whole other group of folks who say, no, this is too much. We're giving too much to the national government. They got stuck with the really unsexy name AntiFederalists. Who wants to be an anti-something, right? They're anti-federalists. And the real irony is, today, if you know, for example, the Federalist Society, today we talk about Federalists as the people who want state sovereignty, and the people who want strong national government. They're not Federalists. Back then it was the opposite. The folks arguing for the Constitution, arguing for the stronger national government, they were the Federalists. And the ones who said, no, we may be just giving up too much from our states, they got labeled, they got second pick, they got labeled the anti-federalist. Now, at some level it makes sense if you understand federalism as being the balance. And because we were so skewed towards state sovereignty, the people who wanted more national government and wanted the Constitution, they were Federalists. They were trying to bring it into balance. And the ones who say, no, let's keep it over here. We like having the states calling all the shots. They were the anti-federalists. Today, since we're skewed way over this way with almost all the power at the national level, the people who want to give more sovereignty to the states and bring it into balance, they are the Federalists. But Federalists have kind of switched sides on the debate from the national side to the state side, which I've always found kind of entertaining. Constitution goes out to the states for ratification. A lot of really smart, impressive, well-spoken, well-written people are arguing for it, and a lot of very smart, impressive, well-spoken, well-written people are arguing against it. I mean, here in Virginia, we had folks like Patrick Henry and George Mason, who had serious doubts that this Constitution was a good idea, while others, Washington, the biggest name there was, he was all in favor of it. So it's a very serious debate. Is this giving too much to the national government? The Federalists say, no, this is the perfect balance, because the national government can only do a few things. It can't do very much. And the Anti-Federalists are saying, yeah, that's what it seems to say in the document. But what if in the future that national government starts doing more stuff? What if it starts taking control of other areas of life? Just to pick really stupid examples. What if the national government decided it had some voice in, education, or health care, or something that's just obviously unconstitutional? The Anti-Federalists were saying, well, you know, things don't always work out the way you think. And so one of the arguments that came up, and this has been a very long introduction, it was most of my talk, to get me to the point of this is the bill where the Bill of Rights comes in. Because one of the arguments raised by the Anti-Federalists was, this thing doesn't have a Bill of Rights. We've all got state constitutions, and they all have bills of rights. Where do these come from? Most of it comes from way back in English history, comes out of the common law, comes out of very Christian history involving natural law and natural rights, that people are created and that they're creator because we bear the image of the Creator. He has endowed us with certain fundamental rights, including, usually it was phrased as life, liberty, and property. The Declaration uses life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I think is also relevant. But long history of what many of these fundamental rights look like. They are all essentially process rights. And of course, the Constitution is mostly a document about how we run government. It's been twisted, it's been warped in recent years by the Supreme Court. So now a lot of substantive outcomes are being decided by the Supreme Court because they say, oh, well, this is in the Constitution, when in fact there's nothing about that in the Constitution, whatever it may be. The rights that are listed, the rights that they thought were important enough to write down, are not rights that define outcomes, they're rights that help people reach outcomes. The United States Constitution doesn't say whether Virginia had to give up man-woman marriage and adopt same-sex marriage. It doesn't say, it's not in there. It does say that we all have rights to free speech, to be involved in the political process. We have the rights to try to influence. And if we persuade people that we ought to have same-sex marriage, then that's the way it's supposed to work under the Constitution. It protects the rights to speak, to worship, to keep and bear arms, to not have the government searching your house frivolously, to, all these, not have cruel and unusual punishments, to have due process of law, procedural protections. If you go out and ask the average person in our society today, what's in the United States Constitution? They have no clue that it's almost all about structure, about limits on what the national government can do. They assume it's a long list of rights. A job, a nice house, health care. I've got rights to all these things. Well, if people want to argue that we should have those rights and that they should be put into the positive law today, they're free to make those arguments. That's certainly not how it was understood at the founding. It's certainly not what was put into the Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights argument was, we need something to protect us from this national government. The Federalists say, national government can't do diddly. Look at Article 1, Section 8. It's got only these few powers. There's no power to control the press, so we don't need to protect freedom of the press. There's no power to control religion, so we don't have to protect freedom of religion. The Anti-Federalist says, yeah, well, they just might do it someday anyway. Guess who was right? It was the Anti-Federalists. They were the ones who were prescient about what the future would hold. And so, even though the Federalists generally took the position that the structure of the national government would keep it from ever infringing individual rights. So you didn't need the kind of a Bill of Rights that the Virginia Constitution and the Maryland Constitution and the North Carolina Constitution, all of those had. They said, we don't think you need it. We think we're protected because this government just can't do a whole lot of stuff. They eventually caved because they weren't going to get it ratified. And especially New York was the place it kind of came down to push versus shove. And Madison, James Madison, leading Federalist, one of the two big authors of the Federalist Papers, along with Hamilton. Jay wrote a few of them, but most of them were Hamilton and Madison. Madison says, okay, if it will help give everybody comfort, I promise you I will go into the first Congress and I will fight to have a Bill of Rights added in a series of amendments to this document. And it was that promise by Madison and some others that eventually turned the tide. The ratification process completed. Amendments were drafted, edited, went back and forth. 12 of them passed Congress and were submitted to the states for ratification. 10 of those 12 were very rapidly ratified by the states and became what we typically call the Bill of Rights. There were 2 others, one of which is still in limbo out there, is never going to be ratified because it's meaningless today. The other was actually ratified in 1992 and became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, one of the Bill of Rights. So if you ever want to really get somebody on a trivia question, ask them, where are the 11 Bills of Rights provisions in the Constitution? 1 through 10 and 27. That's the Bill of Rights. It just took more than 200 years to get 3/4 of the states to ratify. But the first 10 went in there. 9 and 10 are different. 9 and 10 are structural amendments about how to interpret the Constitution. 1 through 8 are lists of individual rights. And so it was as a result of this battle, a result of neither side, first of all, could win the national versus state sovereignty question, so they had to compromise with federalism. The Constitution was viewed as a way of achieving federalism, but you still couldn't get enough political clout to get it ratified until the promise was made by the Federalists, okay, we'll add the Bill of Rights, and they added the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. So, we have it. It is, one thing worth knowing about the Bill of Rights is it only applies to the national government. Little bit, probably take more time to explain than it merits. Most of the Bill of Rights is written in the passive voice. If you're a writer, you know that passive voice is usually problematic because passive voice hides the identity of the actor. So when you say, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be abridged, well, by whom? Congress shall not abridge the right. The states shall not abridge them. That's active voice. You know who's acting. Most of the Bill of Rights is in passive voice, so it's kind of fuzzy. The First Amendment, though, is clear. Congress shall make no law. And it's very clear historically in context that the Bill of Rights was written to bind the national government, and the Supreme Court held that many years ago, a case called Barron versus City of Baltimore. So you've got these 8 amendments full of rights. They only applied to the national government. If a state violated your right to free exercise of religion, your right to freedom of speech, of the press, to assemble, there was no federal constitutional violation. You probably had a state constitutional violation because there were similar provisions in most of the state constitutions. And in the middle of the 20th century, the Supreme Court, this is another talk, you'll have to get me back if you want it, but they came up with a rather illogical but fairly effective doctrine that they call substantive due process, that they somehow managed to park most of the Bill of Rights in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, so it applies against the states. So most of the Bill of Rights now applies to limit both what the national government may do and what the states may do. So, Second Amendment specifically, I'm just going to introduce a few ideas here, and again, we'll let you all go wherever you want to with Q&A. Second Amendment has a prefatory clause that talks about the importance of a well-ordered militia for a free state, and then it has the active clause that says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. For most of our history, nobody got too confused about all of that, but as gun control became a bigger and bigger issue in the 20th century, obviously guns have changed a lot since the American Revolution, right? Most guns in those days were long guns, even pistols were pretty cumbersome, slow to load, not very accurate. A great number of weapons weren't rifled. They were hard to aim, hard to hit the broadside of the barn. You know, as we go through the 20th century, obviously weaponry is becoming much, much more advanced, smaller, easier to hide, much more effective. We get into semi-automatic and automatic weapons. So many people in this country started talking gun control, started saying we just can't let anybody hold all of these weapons, whatever they want to have. The primary argument that was made in response to the Second Amendment objection was, this is an amendment that protects the militia. Because it starts with that prefatory clause saying, why do we have a Second Amendment? Because a militia is necessary. And the gun control folks would say, well, what's the counterpart of militia today? That's the National Guard. Not national troops, but troops that are under state control. And so what the Second Amendment means is that the federal government can't stop a state National Guard from having weapons. Well, there's a little problem with that, which is that it's historical nonsense that is not at all what the founders meant when they talked about militia. By the way, I don't own a gun. I'm not like some of you I'm sure are big gun people, maybe some of you aren't, but I'm not. I do believe in the amendments to the Constitution, though, including the second. So this is not like my personal interest because I'm scared somebody's going to come and raid my gun locker. The militia during the American colonial and founding period did not mean a governmental military unit controlled by the national government or the states or the colonies. The militia meant folks, everybody, exactly. What was the militia? The militia was somebody's out, you know, scouting around, and all of a sudden they're yelling, the redcoats are coming down the road. And everybody grabs their gun and defends the town. Every able-bodied man, which might include 12 and 13-year-old boys, sometimes women, not always, sometimes the women would, you know, take the young kids and hide, but particularly a woman maybe who wasn't married or who was a widow, she'd be getting her gun and getting out there too to defend the homestead. It was the regular people. And so this idea that militia confines the Second Amendment to governmentally controlled military units, whether they're the United States Army or the Virginia National Guard, is just nonsense. That's not what they were thinking. That's not how they understood it. And the Supreme Court correctly made that determination. When the Supreme Court decided District of Columbia versus Heller, they correctly read the history and said, you know, whatever one's personal preferences may be, some people want gun control, some people don't want gun control, the Second Amendment could be repealed if there's enough political will, if you get 2/3 of the House and the Senate and 3/4 of the states. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but at least in theory, it could happen. We can't get 2/3 of the House and Senate to agree that it's Wednesday, okay? They won't agree on anything. The Constitution is not getting amended anytime soon for any reason. Way too polarized in Washington for that to happen. It's there, it's in the document, it is an individual right to keep and bear arms. And then a few years later, McDonald versus Chicago, the court said, and it's one of those rights that's incorporated through this kind of weird process into the 14th Amendment, and it binds the states as well as the national government. So there it is. There is a right, an individual right to keep and bear arms. Now, let me just leave it with this. As a general rule, no constitutional right is absolute. There are always situations where there may be a reason for the government to prevent someone from exercising a constitutional right. I'll give you a couple examples. I'm a religious liberty lawyer. I have been a religious liberty lawyer since 1988. I don't want to think about how many years that is. It's a stinking long time. But I am a huge, huge believer. I have filed briefs with my name on them in the United States Supreme Court protecting religions that I think are totally wrong. and are sending people to hell, but I believe you have the freedom in America to choose wrongly and to believe things that are wrong, because if the government can tell you you can't believe wrongly, they can tell you you can't believe rightly. And so I have filed briefs with my name on the cover protecting the chicken-killing Santeria cult down in South Florida, and some peyote-chewing Native Americans in a case that just devastated religious liberty law. I'm a big believer in religious liberty. I believe that the government needs a really, really important reason to stop someone from practicing their sincerely held religious beliefs. But if somebody walks in here and says, you know, I sincerely believe that God has called me to shoot all blondes, and start shooting, are we all going to step back and say, wow, you know, it's God. It's his religion. He's got a right to practice his free exercise of religion. Of course not. We're going to say, you draw the line here. You draw the line. You may not murder innocent people no matter what you think your religion tells you. I'm a huge believer in free speech and free press. But if on the day before D-Day, if the New York Times had gotten hold of the invasion plans for Omaha Beach and wanted to publish them on page 1 of the New York Times the day before, which, by the way, Germans read the New York Times too, the government absolutely should and correctly would have stopped that from happening. That would have violated those free press rights because there's a more important issue involved. I think with the Second Amendment, there are always going to be some limits. I mean, I think most people would say young children shouldn't be able to purchase operational firearms. Maybe, you know, with mom or dad training, instructing, they can... Did I move out of your camera? I'm sorry. I usually wander around a lot when I tell you. You know, mom and dad maybe can instruct them, but you don't want a kid running around with an armed gun. They may not even know. They may think it's a toy. They may point it at their little sister and go, bang, bang, you're dead, and she really is. You know, that's a reasonable limit. Somebody who has been adjudicated mentally incompetent, who is really and truly crazy, we don't want them having a gun. Maybe somebody who's been convicted of repeated armed violent felonies. You know, maybe that person shouldn't have a gun. There's going to be some limits, and the Supreme Court has recognized that. They've recognized that it's not an absolute right. And I think people on both sides, if they're willing to talk reasonably and not start saying, well, just get rid of all the handguns, you know, or get rid of assault weapons, which people who know more about guns than I do tell me that doesn't even really mean anything. I don't know what an assault, is that an automatic weapon? Is that a semi? What is an assault? I don't know. If you can get away from people just arguing the extreme, as if somehow we're going to make all the guns in the world disappear, there could be some conversations, I think, about what's reasonable and still allows people their constitutionally protected rights. I will say this. I keep saying I'm finishing, but I never finish. We talk today mostly about arms in two contexts. We talk about shooting for sport, whether it's hunting or on a range, and we talk about personal defense. Get that handgun in the nightstand because if somebody breaks into my house in the middle of the night, I want to be able to defend my family. That's not what the founders were talking about. The founders were talking about the ability to fight back against a tyrannical government. They were talking about the right, if the government denies those fundamental rights that are talked about in the Declaration, the people have to stand up like we did against Great Britain and fight. Will that ever happen? I don't know. Will it be really, really messy and ugly? I mean, again, weapons today are much more efficient, much more destructive than anything that those folks were dealing with. I pray that I never have to, my children never have to live through violent rebellion against the government, because there's probably going to be millions slaughtered on both sides. But make no mistake, that's what they were thinking about. They weren't thinking you have a right to keep and bear arms so you can go out and take out a squirrel on Saturday afternoon. They were thinking the redcoats are coming down the road and we will defend our homes. And so it's a strong right. Is it unlimited? Are there some weapons that could appropriately be held to not fall under the Second Amendment? What if I want tactical nuclear warheads in my garage? Can I have those? Yes? The tactical nukes are okay?
Doesn't everyone have those?
You have money.
Actually, I'm selling them. So the courts have developed almost none of this. And maybe we're going to end up with something sensible and reasonable, that the things that are excluded are really not essential to the right to keep and bear arms. Or maybe this is going to get driven by an agenda, may depend on who's the next president, may depend on who controls Congress, may depend on who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, right? This stuff all gets right. I mean, right now the court is looking pretty good, I think, for Second Amendment purposes, with the addition of Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. But you never know. All it takes is a new election, and then one person dies, and things change. Okay, so that's where we are, and let me just, is there kind of a hard stop that you want me to shut up and sit down?
Yes.
Is it now?
Yes.
Okay. Well then, I've enjoyed all your questions tonight. It's been a great conversation. I thought I had an hour. You told me I had an hour.
Well, it's like 3 minutes to 8.
I got one question.
I got 9 minutes till 8. You're
My phone is fast.
yes, it is.
Yeah.
You're connected to Bolivian time. Let me take a couple. Can I take a couple?
Okay, just two and that's it.
And then.
Because we have other people that have.
I understand. And there's important stuff to be done here. Yes.
All right, I had 3, but I only get 1. All right,
One.
So this
They
question,
can do it.
well, I actually don't know the answer to this.
Okay.
Oh.
Does a foreign national individual who illegally enters our country have constitutional rights?
Yes.
Oh.
Some.
Okay, next.
Because the right to due process, the text of the Constitution says persons. It doesn't
Bill.
say citizens.
Bill?
I'm eager to ask this question. What if the Commonwealth of Virginia or the state of Texas were to pass legislation that declared that all adults living in the state of Texas are members of the Texas militia?
Okay.
Would that do anything to diffuse the argument about the preamble in
No. The people who want strict gun control would not be so easily diverted. Their goal is to have only professional soldiers, police officers, Marines, those kind of folks. They would not be, and the legal argument's been resolved. Because the Supreme Court said it's an individual right, you don't have to be part of the militia.
Okay, the guy with the hat is next, and then you. You, in the back, you had your hand up? No?
No.
Okay.
This man.
Not today.
Okay, thank you. So on the observation that the founders meant to enable the populace to overthrow the government, so we had the Doors War in Rhode Island, where they essentially had their state government, even into the 1790s, the proprietor colonial government. So there was still religious tests for office holding and voting.
Yeah, the colonial government lasted forever in Rhode Island. It was still there decades.
But it's my understanding that, was it the Congress or the Supreme Court? I'm sorry, I don't remember the history, said that the proprietary government electing the governor would be the governor. And the proprietary government, there was a whole dual list of offices down to sheriff. And the Congress said the proprietary landholders, senators, and congressmen would be seated in the US Congress. So that seems to me that the founders said that the populace, even when they had a successful revolt, they did take over the government, but the US government said the proprietors would still be in the seat.
I'm going to have to give you a short version of this. That Rhode Island government that had been created under the charter was adopted by the people of Rhode Island as their state government after the Revolution. And so it now took its authority as the state of Rhode Island rather than the British Crown. It lasted well into the 19th century. It was a bad government. It was not hardly democratic at all. Very few people had any voice in the government. A rebel group led by a guy named Dorr came up to fight against that and establish. So for a while, as you say, there were actually two parallel groups, each claiming to be the legitimate government of Rhode Island. Does anybody care that much about Rhode Island that it needs two governments? But it got to the United States Supreme Court in a case called Luther versus Borden, and I don't remember the year, I'm sorry. But the Supreme Court said it's not a question for the courts to decide which of these groups is the legitimate government of Rhode Island. If the federal government is going to answer that question, there's a provision in the Constitution that says the national government guarantees Republican government in the states, and there was a lawsuit under that provision. The court says we can't adjudicate which group is the right group, the real government of Rhode Island. It's a political question. The president or the Congress will have to act. So they basically punted. And in the interim, the Dorr group never won, but the charter government was replaced, and they developed a new constitution and a new government in Rhode Island, and the issue basically went away.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. You'll be taking more.
No,
we done.
we have to stop.
I'm so grateful
I mean,
for the
if you want
time.
to stay,
And I need to leave, but y'all can call me at Regent University if you want to talk, or email me, Brad J, BRADJAC @regent.edu. Happy to chat with you or catch me on the radio.
yeah,
Thank
you
you.
can always catch them on WNIT. Now, we were supposed to have Councilman Mike Lucci here the last time we had a meeting. We had to cancel it, and I'm sorry, I'm probably pronouncing your name wrong. Is it Lucci, right? Bellucci. Sorry, Bellucci, right? So if Mike Bellucci, councilman, very new councilman to Virginia Beach, would come on up and say a few words and tell us all about himself and his experience so far on city council.
I'd be happy to, but am I the only other speaker?
No, we have other speakers too.
Well, I'm
Yeah,
happy to.
so if you
I'm
wanna-
happy to yield as Lee Henderson is here.
Yes, we have a lot of people, we have several
But
candidates
however you
here,
want to do
and
it, I'm happy to come up now, but.
okay, well, I mean, you come up with that, and I usually leave people that are running for campaigns to last.
Oh, that's me too.
That's you too, but you were supposed to be a speaker at our last meeting, so.
We like to see your face.
Yes, and I was supposed to introduce him as one of our new councilmen, and we were supposed to have the other gentleman here as well, but he couldn't come, so anyway, Mike,
Thank you.
you are so welcome.
Well, good evening, and I'm very happy and truly honored to be here with you this evening. I should tell you that even in my short tenure on City Council, I can assure you that as your president, Ms. Howard is a very impactful and effective advocate at City Council. I've been following City Council for a long time, and in the time that I've been there, Ms. Howard is extremely well respected among all members of City Council, and even when there is disagreement, and as you well know, there's plenty of disagreement, the level of respect and civility that she displays on your behalf in the council chambers is consistent and predictable and very much appreciated. And I know and I think that's very important. It's important to me as a public servant and one who aspires to continue to be a public servant. But I think more importantly, consider it and have a public discourse that is worthy of our republic and worthy of our great city. So I'd like to begin my remarks by saying, how much time do I have?
Well, you said you were only gonna like speak for like 10 minutes, is that enough?
Oh, well, I'm just kidding. Oh, well, yeah, no, of course, I want to be respectful, so
Yeah,
so
you
10 minutes. And, well, I'll say this. My name is Michael Lucci. I was appointed to serve, I accepted the honor and the responsibility of being appointed to serve on our city council on May 7th. And I was born in Virginia Beach, raised in the city of Virginia Beach, and I'm very proud to call Virginia Beach my home. I attended First Colonial High School and then went to Northern Virginia to attend college at George Mason University, where I studied government and international politics. After George Mason, I moved to Florida, where I lived in Miami Beach for a period of time, and moved back to Virginia Beach as an adult. At work, I'm the manager of community engagement at the Chrysler Museum of Art, where I've been employed for 8 years. The Chrysler Museum is an incredible institution. I'm very proud to work there. Most of my work is focused on external relations. It's really about welcoming our community to that incredible cultural asset. But not only welcoming people, it's about creating and expanding opportunities for our community to visit the Chrysler Museum. Art museums and other cultural institutions haven't always been places, either for real or perceived reasons, that are welcoming to everyone. And so it's my job to go into the community and not only represent the museum to external audiences, but it's also my job to develop strategic partnerships to invite more people to visit the museum, which, by the way, is always free and it's always changing, and I'm very proud and honored to invite all of you to visit the museum anytime we're open, which is Tuesday through Sunday. It's to make the museum more accessible, ultimately so that our visitors more fully reflect the community we serve. I haven't always worked in community engagement at the Chrysler Museum. I worked in events at the museum before I worked in the community engagement and public relations realm. But in addition to my work, I've been active as a volunteer and in civic life. I serve on the board of a number of nonprofit organizations whose missions I'm passionate about. I formerly served as president of Hampton Roads Pride. I'm on the board of Teens with a Purpose. I was very proud to, until I was appointed to City Council, to be a member of the Virginia Beach Human Rights Commission, and I also served on the board of directors of the Virginia Beach Community Development Corporation. But I do want to be clear on that commission. I was appointed in January of this year to serve on that commission. So as you may be familiar with many of the headlines about alleged mismanagement there, I just want to absolve myself from responsibility for that. I was, and sincerely, I asked to be appointed to that commission when I learned of some of the things there, because I wanted to be part of a public policy solution. And that's also why I wanted to serve on our city council. I want to be helpful to our city. I want to serve our city. I want to help people, and I want to help to create solutions. So I will be happy to share with you some of my public policy priorities, but I don't know if it's appropriate, or I'd be happy to come back, but I'd like to leave time for a few questions.
Do you want people to ask you questions, or did you have?
Yeah, no, I'd like to. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm kind of new to this, but to be honest with you, so I'll go back further to say that I was appointed, and in my application, I was transparent from the beginning that I would very gladly and happily accept the appointment to City Council. I was seeking an appointment to City Council, but that I would be a candidate for the special election in the fall.
And you're running for which district? Somebody
For the
just asked me.
thank you.
Rose Hall.
I'm running for the Rose Hall district, but as many or all of you know, every person who's a voter in Virginia Beach votes for representatives from all the districts, which is it's a unique system. Yeah, so we're all at large. But I also recognize that I was selected to serve on City Council. I was not elected. That is an important distinction. It's one that I'm aware of. It's one that I take very seriously, and that is why I'm here tonight. That's why I'm here all throughout the community, to meet people, to hear from people, and in the effort to earn your support and earn your vote. I'm very happy to be hosting the first town hall that I've ever participated in as a member of City Council, and that's a listening session that we're hosting at Green Run High School tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. And I would like to invite all of you to join us for that. We'll be having a facilitated discussion, and as well as we've invited a number of city leaders who are subject matter experts to help answer your questions, because I also want to acknowledge I have a lot to learn. I'm new on the job. I'm not going to stand before you and claim to be an expert on any particular subject other than art museums and a few others. But seriously, I do understand that I'm not an expert, and I do know that I have a steep learning curve, and that I have a lot to learn, not only about the mechanics of city government, but about the ways that we can create solutions to the issues challenges that we face together. But it's something that I'm excited about the opportunity to do, and I'm looking forward to doing it collaboratively. I do want to emphasize that I'm a consensus builder. I think it's important to find where we agree first, and let's start there. And I'll take one example that has nothing to do with City Council, although to my great regret, we did have a discussion about this issue, and that's about guns. And I'll say that we could talk about process, and that's one thing that I'll be happy to take questions about or go into further at another time. But what was frustrating to me, not only at the City Council level, but in our national discourse, is that there are a number of things that are related to firearm-related violence, or just about violence in our community in general, where we agree. But why aren't we talking about those things first? And it's not only mental health. There are other components to this discussion that relate to safety, public safety. Why are we going to the furthest polar ends first? Because we never address the middle part. And I'm just using this because it's topical and it's on our minds as an illustration of how I think we can work together to govern. I realize that, that to some degree, this is idealistic and utopian, and I know that we're not always going to be able to agree on everything, but at least let's try, let's start there, because if we start from polar opposite ends, we're never going to ever address any of the issues that we face together. And so that's the approach that I take, and that's a virtue that I aspire to bring to my service on our City Council, and frankly, I think we've already done some of it. I'm proud to say I've already had some successes. So I could continue and go on, but I do want to give a chance to answer a few questions. We want to be respectful of your time and thankful to be here. Yes,
Anybody
sir.
got a question?
What do you feel are your biggest flaws, and how are you going to address them?
I talk too much. No, I mean, actually, you know, I think that's one. I have a tendency, particularly when there's a dialogue happening, to want to jump right in. I think it's important to listen, but not only listen to my colleagues on council, but to really make sure that any public servant listens very carefully. So sometimes I have to remind myself of that, because I think it's in our human nature to want to communicate and want to talk. And I need to make sure to remind myself to be careful to listen, which is what I'm going to do right now. Go to the next question. Yes, sir.
So, be strong after the tragedy. I just feel like I'm not doing enough for healing, and what are we doing other than collecting money? Because it seems like we should be developing connections with others, with the people that lost, the families that lost their lives. How are we putting people together to heal that way, not just wear a t-shirt?
Yeah, that's great. I think it's a great question. I'll say that I really believe that we are VB strong. As I mentioned, I grew up here. I'm familiar with the city, but one of the great experiences that I've had in this very short burst of serving on council is that I have had a whole new perspective. Thought I knew Virginia Beach, and then I went through this process, and there's a whole new world. I've never been to this room before with all of you. I mean, it's opened my eyes. And so I've had a chance not only of that, and we could spend whole hours talking about that terrible tragedy that occurred. But I will say that as in the role, the official responsibilities that I had as a member of council, I've had perspective to see people coming together. Of course, you can go to loveforvb.com, and there's a list of opportunities where people can not only give money, but there are volunteer opportunities. But I've seen various industries come together. For example, the construction and design industry was tremendously impacted by the event that unfolded on May 31st because those were their colleagues. And I attended with many other people, this is just one of many, a fundraiser that occurred there, but it was more than a fundraiser. It was a rally, it was a demonstration of support for city staff and for colleagues in the design and construction industry. So, and I also went to, for example, a walk at Mount Trashmore. There are these individual things that are happening that are pretty extraordinary, and but I think they're happening. I hate to say silos, but they're happening in all kinds of different ways throughout the city, but also throughout Hampton Roads, and that's pretty neat to see too. But I also will tell you that right before I came here, I attended a town hall discussion for city staff that was hosted by the mayor and others in Building 19, and that was illuminating. I left there early to be here, and I'm happy to be here, so happy to be here, but to be honest with you, in some ways, I was sorry to leave that discussion because it opened my eyes to the experiences of city staff in a way that was coming through not only department heads. And we're doing some surveys and other things, but we still have a long way to go. We are Virginia Beach strong, and there's no question about that, but I think we have a long way to go. There's a lot of people who, including probably many in this room, who are in the healing process. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. First of all, thank you, Mike, for joining us tonight. I liked what you said about finding points where we connect and can agree. However, sometimes that's misused. It's a tactic that it's misused as a tactic toward inching down a slippery slope toward an end goal at one of those poles that you talked about, right? Polar opposites, okay? So, principally speaking, I think it's very important to talk principally speaking. And so, what then is your personal principled end goal in terms of this rise of socialism in America? Because it starts at the city, it starts at municipal levels, right? So where do you stand in that? What is your end goal in terms of what you would like to see? Thank you.
Well, that's a multifaceted question.
I can simplify it if you want.
Well, first I'd like to tell you why I want to serve, and without getting into specific issues, which I'm happy to do another time. But I envision a Virginia Beach where everyone has an opportunity to fulfill their full potential. Now, there's a key word there, opportunity. Everyone has an equal opportunity to fulfill their full potential. That's my view, and that is the conditions that I would like to create. What is my philosophy of governing? I'd be happy. Is that what you were going to ask me?
Well, I was just going to ask, so is that everybody has the opportunity, equal opportunities, because government is facilitating things for people and getting in everybody's business, or because the government is stepping away and letting everybody, do their thing?
Well, I believe in individual liberty.
Oh, good.
I'm very proud, and I think this is germane to the conversation that's happening in this room. But you should know that when I was studying government and international politics at George Mason, which is just a fancy word for a Bachelor of Arts degree, but it was nice, and I did have a nice time there. But I did an internship for more than 1 year at the Heritage Foundation, which probably many of you are familiar with. And at the Heritage Foundation, I had really the benefit at a young age of being exposed to a philosophy of government that respects the individual, that emphasizes personal responsibility, and that recognizes the importance of limited government. Now, I'm not going to stand here before you and tell you I'm a hardcore, I think we need to work together, and I'm collaborative. But that is where I'm starting from, and that's something that I think you may be interested in knowing.
So socialism in America yeah, it's okay, or no, we need to stand
I
against it?
think America's a democratic republic. A constitutional monarchy.
Thank you.
Good answer.
Thank you.
Yes, we're in the middle of the hurricane season, and because I'm on the CCO, I get feedback from the civic leagues. There's many areas in our city that the city has not cleared out the infrastructure to move the water to the piping canals. Are you going to be attending the seminar this Saturday over at Bow Creek that we're going to be
I think
addressing?
it starts at 10 a.m.
That's
I'm
correct.
planning.
Okay, and then I'll discuss it with you then.
Okay?
So,
Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to come back another time. Thank you.
thank you, we appreciate it. We have two school board members here, Vicki Manning and Laura Hughes. Do either of you want to update us on anything going on with the school board?
The retreat.
Yeah.
No retreat, no surrender.
No surrender. Well, I could talk for hours about this, so I'm going to try to sum it up in just a couple minutes. But we just had our annual working retreat, and we started it out with the topic of board governance. Basically, the board telling three of us how we should act. We were recently removed from all committees because they don't like our transparency. And that's something that we're fighting against right now. I was particularly on the audit committee, and I voiced a lot of concerns about spending problems and other issues taking place, and I made those transparent to the public, and my colleagues were not pleased with that, so it was removed from that committee. And Ms. Hughes, who is an attorney by trade, had requested to be on the policy committee where she has expertise, and she was not allowed to serve on that committee. So Ms. Weems, Ms. Hughes, and I are not on any of the three major decision-making committees of our school board right now. So even though you elected us to represent you, you're not getting that representation right now. So did you have anything to add about that? Maybe steps forward?
Well, what committees are you on?
Well, there are about 20 committees that we serve on. Some of them are the top 3 are voting committees. Those are the ones that we're not on. We serve as liaisons to other committees. I have been put on, the building utilization committee. No, that's you.
I'm on that. That meets yearly if needed.
I'm on the CIP committee. CIP committee that meets as needed, typically once a year, and I'm also on a committee called the Interagency for Adult Basic Education, which I don't even know what it is, and I'm still trying to find out what it is and where it meets and when it meets. I think it's once a year also.
What are the three?
Wow.
Audit, policy,
And legislative. Those are the top 3 committees that none of us are on. Did you, go ahead.
I watched the retreat online,
So did I.
and what really struck me was that they're planning on having a $24 million surplus, but a $5.8 million slush fund as a contingency fund. And they're talking now about how to go spend that money, and having those discussions at the retreat where citizens aren't even allowed to come and sort of participate in that conversation. And, you know, I guess what strikes me is, and I know you didn't agree with it, but the board said, oh, we want to have a tax increase, went to city council to pay for full-day kindergarten and all that. We continue to have these $20 to $24 million surpluses, but why is it the thought process that that money can just be spent as opposed to return?
Well, okay, with the reversion funds, or slush fund, that can be used for one-time expenses. You obviously can't have it for ongoing, which is how they justified asking for the tax raise for full-day kindergarten, because obviously that's a continuing. I don't think they should just feel like they should ask for tax raises regularly because we're not an ATM machine. But, so the problem is that those priorities are not being set at the beginning of the budget. And so they wait till the end and kind of hold you up and say, we have to use all this, or we need a tax raise, and it's last minute, and it's panic, and they're at meetings where all of the public input that's expected has been done and they're operating in the dark, which is the same reason that these retreats are not filmed or advertised. So, and fortunately,
And
he
just as
got
a
it all.
follow-up, you went into an actual school board meeting, and we weren't allowed to participate in that, and it wasn't videotaped or recorded, and you agreed to extend the superintendent's contract and all this. You actually went into a session after this retreat.
Well, let me finish the first
Okay.
topic. So we have a wonderful CFO. Our CFO is he's a conservative type of guy, and I think he does a very good job managing our budget. But he's limited by what the school board directs him to do. The $24 million was basically the money that he has said, we have budgeted for all personnel costs, all the necessary costs. Here's $24 million, school board. I want to give, he wanted to make a point. This is all you have left, but yet you want to fund full-day kindergarten, you want to give teachers raises, you want to build, you want to do this, this, and this, but you only have $24 million to do $100 million worth of priorities. So that was kind of like a lesson for the board to say, what are your priorities? And, you know, I specifically said, even though I was not in support of funding full-day kindergarten, the board has made a decision to do that, and we have to do that. We can't keep using one-time monies for that program. My colleagues on the board disagree. and it's giving our CFO a heart attack. I mean, I'm concerned that our CFO is going to leave if they keep spending money like that, because he could be criminally liable as well as we could as well for not properly spending taxpayer dollars. So regarding the superintendent's contract, that was on the agenda. I specifically brought my phone to film the event because the retreats are not filmed, so that is on my Facebook page. I'll be putting it on my website as well, if I can figure out how to do that. And then, so we did vote on whether or not to extend the superintendent's contract. The media got it wrong today. They reported that we extended it to 2024. It was actually to 2023. And Ms. Weems, Ms. Hughes, and I all three voted to not extend his contract.
Well, my question was, why do that? Apparently, it has been the practice of the school board to take this 4-year contract and every year extend it, so there's always a 4-year contract. That is just a perpetual open-ended contract. And the reason given was, you have to have a contract in place at least 120 days before the contract ends. And if we don't have a 4-year buffer, we might forget. It's on the video, that was the actual answer.
I don't think we'll let you forget.
Elaine?
Did I understand correctly too, they're thinking about creating a budget committee which would be comprised of the heads of the other committees where you would, again, not be involved in the committee?
So they want that to be the governance committee. So the governance committee that's going to tell us what we can and can't do as board members and create bylaws that will restrict us and restrict our transparency to the public. That would be the governance committee that they want to, the chairs of those top 3 committees would then be on the governance committee telling us what we can do and what we can't do. So I'm obviously not in favor of that. There was some discussion of having a performance and planning committees that would meet to discuss budget issues and things like that. And having more planning, like Ms. Hughes was talking about, how we get to the budget decision and we haven't discussed what our priorities are until after the budget has been presented to us, basically. So, you know, I don't see any problems with that unless we're excluded from those as well.
Okay,
Thank you.
can we have a